Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 3 of our user-friendly records management webinar series. Today, we will be talking about building the foundation. This is all about implementation details for SharePoint and for Collabware. My name, as you may recall from number 1 and number 2, is Rick Martin. I'm the practice lead for Enterprise Content Management here at Habanero. We have a guest speaker with us today as well. We have Ben Skelton, my colleague and business partner. He's our vice president, based in our Toronto office. He will be talking about building an exceptional user experience. He's a very experienced practitioner and has a lot of experience in the user experience domain. So I look forward to him contributing to some of the topics for discussion today. For the few new folk in our audience, we had few new sign-ups since session 2. Welcome to our webinar series. If you need to see the previous sessions, you can find them on YouTube. If you were with us in session 1 and session 2, welcome back. Great to see you. I hope you find this valuable. So Habanero creates great workplace experiences through technology. I think about this as a collection of technology solutions, technology approaches that uplift people's workplace experiences. We've been working in this realm from an employee portal or from an intranet perspective for many years, and we are increasingly moving all of our experiences with employee portals into our work within the enterprise content management or records management space. And I think we're producing some really, really incredible results, and hopefully we get a chance to show you some of those results today. Our partner in this is Collabware. Collabware is a software company just based down the street from us, actually. They build intelligent enterprise information management software. They're really focused on making it simple, seamless, and transparent. And in that, we are perfectly aligned, particularly in regards to the simplicity that we want to bring to the experience. Okay, so this is our agenda for this morning, or this actually was our agenda for this morning. We have a lot of content to get through. And so I'm not going to go through the first 2 sections here, user-friendly records management and describing our webinar series. I went through both of those sections in detail in the previous 2 webinars we did, so I would encourage you to go back and listen to them. They've been posted on YouTube to give you a little bit more perspective on what we consider to be user-friendly records management and why we think user records management is super important. So the agenda today remains, Ben will be talking about creating a great user experience. After that, I'm going to talk about record categories, content roles and content types, really the integration between SharePoint and Collabware. And then finally, we're going to talk about some of the finer implementation details. So with that, I'm going to hand it straight off to Ben. Over to you, Ben.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Rick. Hi, everybody. I'm here to talk to you today about creating a great user experience. So I thought I'd start the talk by actually defining user experience, or asking the question, what is user experience? I think when I talk to a lot of people often think of user experience as design. But here at Habanero, we think of user experience as much more than design. When we think of a really usable or a great user experience, we think of things like findability. Can you find the information you're looking for? Usability. Is a system easy to use? And ultimately, usefulness. Is what you're getting actually useful? And so when we look at the practice of user experience at Habanero, we really think of 3 components: information architecture, interaction design, and content strategy. We believe user experience is a really, really powerful tool and one of the most important things we can do to create a successful experience for somebody. We're really focused at Habanero in creating great workplace experiences for people, and I think user experience is one of the ways we do that. I read this quote a number of years ago. It was a comment posted in The Guardian. The Guardian was talking about a solution or a system that people were using, and the quote is, "I wouldn't say that the system was the reason I quit my last job, but it definitely was a factor in my decision." And I thought this was such a powerful call to arms to us. If we create a great experience or a great solution for somebody, we're actually going to impact their work experience and make their work life better. If we create a poor experience for them, that has a factor, or that has an implication in them, in their job satisfaction, but ultimately their happiness at work. And so I think this is so powerful and something we believe in really strongly. I think the first component about creating a great user experience is really understanding your audiences. It's interesting, when I talk to organizations, sometimes they'll say to me, Ben, we've got our requirements. I just need you to design the solution. We want to make it easy to use. And I think this is a really interesting and fundamental challenge with a lot of records management projects. I think so often we focus on the business. We focus on what the business needs. We focus on our requirements around compliance, for example. We focus on our business stakeholders, but we don't actually focus enough on the people that are using the solution. We tend to think of them as our users. They have to use the solution. We want to make it as great as possible, but we don't spend enough time learning about them or the culture of our organization that these solutions are going to be used in. I really love this quote. I learned more at cocktail parties than by photographing documents. This is by Kim Philby, a Soviet spy. And I think this actually applies to what we're trying to do here. When we get a number of requirements and they're in documents, that doesn't actually tell us about the people or really the culture that this system will live in. And I think this is such a powerful concept. We want to create solutions that really fit into the culture of each organization we build them for, and every organization has a different culture. And I think this is really key. We would never design a records management solution for one organization and just transplant it into another. Each organization has different individuals, different people, a different way of working, and a different culture, and we really want to be culturally sensitive to that. So the key way we do that is learning about our users. And I gotta be honest with you, I really hate the word users. It kind of feels to me like somebody that's really forced to use our solution. I love the word audiences because it really means we have to attract them. We have to want them to come and use our solution. They're not somebody that's forced to use it. We actually, well, they may be, but that's not what we want. We want people to actually want to use our solution and like using our records management solution. I think this is such a powerful concept. Rick talked about this in session 2, that we're actually in competition with various technologies. People are using Dropbox, people are using file shares, people are using other technologies to share and store information. And really, we need to create a solution that people want to use so they don't use those other tools. One of the first things we do when we start out any project to understand our audiences is listening labs. And I think listening labs are one of the most powerful tools you have in understanding the people that will be using your solution. So typically we'll meet with anywhere from 15 to 20 people in an organization, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, in different roles, different departments, and different locations. And we've got a light script, and really what we do is we want to understand how they work. We want to understand what their goals are, how they're working today. What are some opportunities that we can actually make their lives better? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the risks that we see for the project in working with these individuals? What you can see here in one of the photos is a listening lab participant we had in an organization. And I think what was so powerful in this image is you can see in our workspace, there's paper everywhere. There's documentation, there's a binder, there's things on the wall. And this is really powerful for us. I think far too often we focus on systems. We focus on, okay, we've got the shared drive and we want to move to a different records management system. But we don't actually take into account all of the different things people are using outside of these systems and how they work today. So we really, really recommend taking time to focus on individuals that are using the solutions and how they work. So a few tips around listening labs. Typically, we like to do one-on-one sessions. I find they're much more rich. I find when you have more than one person, the feedback you get isn't as open and as honest. Ideally, you want people from different roles, different departments, and if you have more than one location, different locations. The field can be a really interesting place as well. If you've got people out in the field that you want to use your records management solution, they may be a great person or people to go out to and look at how they're working as well. I love in-person listening labs because, as I said in the last slide, you really get to see somebody's workspace, and there's so many kind of great nuggets of information when you look at their workspace and look how they work. But remote can be okay as well. Sometimes we'll start up a Skype for Business session or a WebEx session and understand how people are working on the desktop. It's not quite as powerful, but you still get a ton of great information. I think the key too is to look at the entire ecosystem of tools that people are using. I think far too often, as I said before, we'll focus on moving people from the shared drive to our new records management solution. But when you do a listening lab, it can be really, really fascinating. You know, people have secret ways where they store information, or they're locked out of this, so they use this instead, or they're secretly installed Dropbox or something else that your organization hasn't banned them from using yet. And I think that's really, really fascinating. When we look at the entire ecosystem of tools, we can really start to understand how people work and why they're doing the things they do. And as I said before, don't forget about that physical workspace. It can be really, really powerful. And really what we want to do is we want to understand the goals, the opportunities, the challenges, and the risks to the project as well. So I want to understand what users are trying to accomplish or trying to do. I think this is really, really important, and this actually should be something that you document and take into your change management and communication activities. I think far too often when we do change management, we really focus on this is really exciting because the business will now be more compliant, or this is exciting. And most of those this is exciting are really from a business point of view. And what's interesting is with the listening labs, we can understand the user's goals, or I should say the audience group's goals, and we can actually take those goals and use those as part of our communication strategy. So we heard from you that this was, something that you want to do. We can actually make that easier or more efficient for you to do. Again, you could look at challenges and say, these are some of the challenges we've heard from you that you have. We've made these challenges go away, or we've made this a lot better. And that can be great as well. So I think listening labs are great, not only because they'll make your solution better, but they actually really help inform your communication and change management activities, which is an awesome thing. Sometimes we like to document our listening lab findings in empathy maps. And really, empathy maps are a way of documenting, for each audience group type, what are they seeing, what are they saying, doing, feeling, and hearing. And the goal of this is for us to really help build empathy for our users. And so we've had rooms before where we've had 5 or 6 empathy maps that document each of the audience types and what is really important to do for them. And then we've actually had, the information architects, the records managers, the designers, and the developers all review the empathy maps. And I think this can be such a powerful tool because as we're creating this solution, they've always got the audience groups in mind that are using the solution. And they're designing for them, not necessarily for the business, which is a really powerful thing because ultimately we want these folks to be delighted by what we build. So as I said before, listening labs are very, very powerful because not only will they allow us to create a better solution, but we'll have those stories as part of our change management and launch strategy. Sometimes too, we'll gather stories that are so powerful, we'll actually do a presentation to an executive team or the executive committee on our findings, and they can be really, really inspiring for the executive team on, look at these challenges we found, look at these opportunities, look at how we're changing things for the better. And I think those are really, really powerful stories. The next activity we do is information architecture and design. And I think as information architects and as records managers, this can be actually one of the most challenging activities. It's really, really tough to balance audience needs with political realities. I'm sure you've had that situation where you're working with a VP of a department or a group and they really want something even though it's not right for your audiences. It's unlikely to be successful. It works actually against what our audiences want to do. And I think the key here is one of the areas that we can help build our case against some of these political challenges is through research. So as I said before, the listening labs can be one place where you can get some of these stories. Another technique we do, or another research thing that we do, is card sorting. Card sorting is a way where we actually kind of put all of the, it could be the team site structure, could be departmental content, it could be maybe business processes, pretty much everything you're trying to do. You put on cards, you can have a couple hundred cards, for example, and you have a group of people sort those cards. And it's really interesting because you don't want these people to actually create your structure or your information architecture for you. That's not the process of it. You're not outsourcing your work. Really what it is it's a tool for you to understand how people think of the things or the content or the structure you're trying to organize. I think this is really, really powerful, especially if you're not as familiar with the content. So as I said, you can really structure anything you want or use card sorting to structure anything you want. Typically with a card sort, we'll do 10 to 12 people in groups of 4 to 5. I've had card sorts with as many as 25 or 30 people in groups of 4 or 5, and it can be a little crazy from a logistical perspective, but it can be very, very powerful. Each card should have a task or area. Typically, I have about 200 cards. It obviously depends on what you're sorting. You may have less, you may have a few more. And it's actually a longer activity. It's about 2 to 3 hours in length. And what I tend to do is I tend to have the activity go for about 2.5 hours, give groups a stack of cards and ask them to sort them in a way that makes sense for them. And really you want people working together. So you want them, you don't want people kind of here, you take a quarter of the cards, you take a quarter, you take a quarter, you take a quarter, and then we'll come together. That's not really all that valuable. What you want them doing is discussing the cards as a group, discussing how they're going to organize them as a group. I love kind of walking around and listening to people and how they're thinking of the tasks or content that we want them to sort and their rationale for it. And what I really love to do is have each group, so reserve some time at the end to have each group present their structure and rationale. And I think what's fascinating about card sorting is so often there's so much similarity. There's actually typically more similarity than there is differences. Sometimes you get an oddball group who will sort things in a bizarre way. I had one group that sorted things in things I like and things I don't like, which wasn't overly helpful. But then I've had other groups sort things in just ways that I would have never thought about. And I think the key here is you may not actually organize the information like a group has organized that information, but what you may actually do is maybe you have refiners or filters or another technique to allow them to get to that information in that way. So maybe you create this really great search experience that has those refiners that use different structures. So I think card sorting is such a powerful, powerful tool. I was working with one client that was pretty political, and it was really fascinating. That was the one where we did, I think, about 35 people in a card sort, and we had a number of teams, and they had 2 departments that really, they didn't really love each other. They didn't want their content to be together, but every single group in the organization or in the card sort put that content and those groups together. So it was a really powerful kind of weapon in our arsenal to argue with the politics or to say that, this actually, when we look at how our audiences are sorting this information and looking for this information, this is how they're looking for it. And that was really exciting because both groups agreed that, okay, the research really does show that we can live with that decision. And so I think card sorting is a really great way to wrap your head around all of the content and to help you understand how those audiences think of content. So once you've done all that, we typically will do wireframes, or we'll create wireframes, I should say. And what wireframes are is wireframes are really a blueprint for the solution that we're going to create. So you can see here's a wireframe. It's typically in black or white. We tend to create really in-depth wireframes. So they have, as much as possible, real content, real sections, real tools. They can have anything you want, but they should be really real. I think far too often organizations put wireframes in and they say, title here, title here, title here. And people don't really look at them in the same way. But the minute you have real content in your wireframes, what you see people do is they say, where's that content coming from? That order or that rationale doesn't make any sense. Who's going to create that? How are we going to govern that? And so I think wireframes are really powerful. They allow us to take away the design components and really focus on what we're building. They're great too because you can give them to the developers and you can say to the developers, this is what we're thinking of building. You can even get this in front of your stakeholders. You can even test this with users or audience groups, which I'll talk about later. So a really, really, really powerful thing. We love creating wireframes. I think it's one of those kind of key steps where you've done all your research and then the solution comes to life. I think wireframes may be new to a number of people as well, because typically what we saw with traditional records management solutions is you're using a product. The product's kind of designed for you already. You may be able to customize it, you may be able to configure it, but ultimately you don't have much control over the look and feel. And I think that's one of the most powerful things around SharePoint records management, or really SharePoint collaboration and content management, is the fact that we can create these amazing experiences that are customized for each organization and the way they work. And I think that's really powerful. And so I don't think wireframes were typically a part of many records managers' kind of tools, but I think more and more as you start to look at SharePoint as this enterprise content management tool, as you look at it as the place where records get declared and records management happens, maybe behind the scenes, I think more and more wireframes are a really useful starting point for you to communicate to the business and to your end users what you're actually doing and what you're building. And the great thing about wireframes is you haven't built anything yet, so you can move things around, you can test things, you can change things really, really easily before you start developing. One thing to note though, before I presented wireframes to organizations before, and I said, here are the wireframes. And I've had a number of people say, oh, this is a really hideously ugly system. It's really important for people to know that these are just the wireframes and they will have a user experience. You can see here on this next slide, that's that wireframe come to life. So what I tend to do is show people a wireframe, show them how that will change into a really, really elegant, easy to use, beautiful content management system, but show them that we're actually going to focus on the wireframes at the beginning. So speaking of kind of beautiful, well-designed systems, I think traditionally as well, enterprise content management solutions and records management solutions, we really didn't have much control over the design. But as we look at SharePoint content management solutions or records management solutions, we actually have the ability to create a really great design. And I think this is really, really powerful. We don't have to go overboard, but when we do, we want to create a solution that actually looks like it's part of the organization as opposed to a piece of software that might be as friendly or really doesn't fit into the overall brand of the company. So when we look at creating a better design, we really look at 4 components or 4 steps in our process. We tend to do a brand review, so really look at the organization's brand and the components that we want. In some cases, this may not be the organization's brand as much as the intranet brand where your solution will live. We do a design questionnaire, we create a scrapbook, and then we build mock-ups. So as I said, from a brand review, really for a lot of organizations, we want our records management or our collaboration solution to be part of our organization and part of our brand. We don't want people to go to a solution and say, oh my, this looks completely different, this isn't as easy to use. I think branding is so powerful because it really indicates to people, if you go to a solution and it's really nicely branded, again, it doesn't have to be overboard, but it has a similar feel, it has a similar aesthetic to it. What you'll notice is people immediately feel more comfortable with the solution. They trust the solution more. There's a sense of quality around the solution because it fits into the brand of the organization and the tools that they're used to using. I think this is really powerful. So what we traditionally do is spend a little time with folks. We sit down and understand, what elements of the organizational brand do we want to incorporate in the solution? Are there elements of the intranet brand that we want to incorporate as well? Should this be under that intranet and umbrella? So it's this idea that you get your communication and you get your collaboration all in one spot, or should it actually have its own identity and own brand? So the next activity we do is create a design questionnaire. And the design questionnaires are really great because what it allows you to do is engage various stakeholders in your organization in the visual design of your solution. And Rick talked about engagement a lot, engaging different people in your organization. And I think this is a really, really powerful thing. So typically what we'll do is we'll send the design questionnaire to maybe 8 to 10 different stakeholders. Anybody that could veto design, you should likely send it to them. Maybe you've got somebody in charge of internal communications or internal branding. It's great because it allows them to be part of the process as well. And what you want to dig into is you want to dig into how people think the solution should look and feel. The questionnaire typically includes a number of examples, so people can say, I like this or I don't like this. And then what we tend to do is review all of the design questionnaire answers in a scrapbook that we create. And really, the scrapbook discusses things like the personality and mood of the solution, the relationship between the solution we're creating and the corporate brand, the color palette, the typeface or fonts that we're using, and the design inspiration for the solution. And I think this is a really, really powerful tool. Where I think the scrapbook and the design questionnaire works best is where you've got a conflict in the organization. I was working with one company and it was fascinating because we got the design questionnaire back and half the people wanted the collaboration area to have kind of an old time look and feel and the other half wanted it to be really modern, really fresh. And you could imagine that that's kind of a no-win situation. And instead of having a designer go and try to create something, what we did is we came back to people and said, here are our findings from the design questionnaire and we need to make a decision. Are we going with something more traditional or are we going with something more modern? The organization, it was great because they decided as a group, okay, we're going with something more modern. And then when they actually saw the scrapbook, they really liked the elements of it. And then we went really quickly into mock-ups as well. What you can see here is this is actually a mock-up of a really friendly content and records management solution. And I think this is this is kind of a neat example because as you can see here, it's not, a crazy design, but what it is it's very clean, it's very usable, it's very well organized. So this is the departments and team area for an organization. You can see at the very top there, you've got your featured global sites. On the left-hand side, you've got a filter bar. So there's a number of different filters that people can use. They can do a keyword search. And you'll notice that the site has a really great use of color as well. So I can see the selected filters at the top in blue. So I can see my location, I can change it. I've got a type selected, I can immediately remove it. I can clear all my filters with one click. We're also using color in interesting ways here as well. So you can see a padlock beside budget and an SBP. I think what's interesting is there's actually 3 different levels here. So I can see things that I have access to, things that are locked and they have an icon but I can still see, and then things that are invisible to me. And so these are the elements that we want to take in a design and we want to make sure that are captured. So you can see design isn't necessarily just about branding, but it's about making the tools that we have available to users easier to understand and easier to use. And finally, usability testing. Usability testing is a great technique to understand how our audiences will actually use the solution we create. Sitting them in front of the solution and walking them through it can be a really, really powerful tool in understanding what's easy to use, what's a little more challenging to use, and where there's problems in our design or in our interface that we should fix to make the experience much better for each of our audience groups. So usability testing, if we look at the basics, typically we only do 10 to 12 participants, so we have them one-on-one in front of the computer. Like our listening labs, they can be remote or in person. And really what we do is we sit each participant down and we've got a rough script and it's a bit of an interview. So we'll say, how would you do this? And typically they're using a mock-up, so they can't actually click on anything. But what we can understand is where they would go, and then we'll often change the mock-up to the next mock-up in the set and understand how they would interact with the solution there. This can be so powerful because we often find little areas that we can tweak, and they're very easy to tweak in the mockups, and it's a lot less expensive than doing it in the development stage. So I think this is a really, really powerful thing that you can use when you're testing your various mockups with your audience group before you do development. I'll often do a second round of usability testing when we're in the late beta stage of our solution, when it's actually out there with another group of audience members, and test it with them. And I think the key is with usability testing, I even think usability testing is great for a solution that you really don't have a lot of control about or a control of, because I think the key with usability testing is obviously we want to fix these things. But I think it's still worth doing if you can't fix everything, because this can actually go into our change management activities. It may go into our training. So if we know there's an area that's more confusing to use, we can actually train individuals on that. So our chance of adoption and consumption will be a lot more successful. So hopefully you enjoyed our little 101 on usability testing and user experience design. And I'm going to pass it back over to Rick. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Ben. That was awesome. So now we're going to jump into what I've called record categories, rules, and types. So this is really all about the interconnection between Collabware and SharePoint. So this interconnection is primarily managed using SharePoint content types and then Collabware content rules, record categories, and workflows. And those record categories and workflows are both Collabware concepts. So this isn't intended to be an exhaustive overview, of course, of either SharePoint or Collabware. This is an overview of how that integration between SharePoint and Collabware is performed. And if anything, I'm taking sort of a fairly straightforward mainstream scenario. As we think about this stuff, simplicity is better in these ideas. You can get much, much more sophisticated than we're going to get into here, but it does get harder and harder to track. For example, to track how one particular content type links back to particular record categories, for example. So content can match multiple record categories, and there's a sort of level of precedence behind which one it sort of sticks to, if you like. But it can be very complex to determine where one specific item or one specific content type lands within your file plan. This sounds very complex, but actually this really is the power of Collabware. So be warned, try to keep these things simple. As you start to engage and you start to plan around these things, simplicity is actually your friend. You can do much, much more than we're going to walk through today. And some places that will make sense. But try to keep it as simple as possible where you can. So we're just going to go through a quick recap. I've called it documents to disposition. So we're going to go through in the next few slides how all of these things hang together, because that will set us up for a foundation of the subsequent section within our deck here today around some guidelines for content types and some guidelines for content rules. Those guidelines don't really make sense unless we're all on the same page around how all this is together. So first of all, we have SharePoint team sites. I'm sure everybody knows about that. In this case, this is my sort of icon SharePoint team site. We have 3 document libraries here. We've got that left-hand nav, the yellow bars on the left, and then sort of the title. The SharePoint team sites are hierarchical as well. So we have a couple of subsites, and then, like I say, the yellow lumps are document libraries. So just to zoom in on a team site here, in this case, we have 3 document libraries on this page. Now, you're probably very aware you can add document libraries to the various zones inside of SharePoint. You can have one document library on the page, you can have multiple document libraries on the page, and so on and so forth. In this case, we're going to zoom in a bit further on one specific document library. This document library has documents in it, and then for the sake of conversation, we're going to have some additional columns. And a column is just best considered an additional item or two of metadata that's linked to that document, or it could be a record, of course. As we think about this from a SharePoint context, this collection of columns is best delivered through the use of a content type. And content types are a SharePoint thing that really, in this context right now, this allows you to add columns consistently across your SharePoint environment, or at least your SharePoint site collection. We'll get a little bit more into that stuff down the line. So by associating the document library with this content type, as we upload documents into this document library, SharePoint knows that it's a particular document type, and it knows to at least ask for the metadata if it's needed, or at least put a spot there for the metadata for the user to enter the metadata. So in this case, we'll talk about, say, a finance team site. We'll look at the invoices document library. So you can see here that we have a couple of extra columns. So thinking about invoices, a couple of fairly common columns might be the vendor, might be another column of date paid. This is just metadata that we assign to each invoice. So we're going to jump into the next piece here. So remember this piece. We're going to just describe how record categories work, and then we're going to pull all this stuff together. So thinking about record categories, you can see here we have primary, secondary categories. For the sake of argument, we have some notion of retention associated with each record category as well. And then to link it back to our previous example, we have finance category, and then 1010 invoices, and 1020 is contracts. Okay, so then the last piece of this puzzle is content rules. So the best way to think about content rules is it's just really a search. It's a search that creates a match. It's worth saying what we're looking at here is actually called a basic content rule inside of Collabware. What we're saying is that if the content type matches an invoice content type, then create a match. There are much more sophisticated content rules inside of Collabware. There's actually a content rule called a single condition and a multiple condition content rule. And that's the single and multiple condition over and above this basic match condition. These other content rules can be really useful for reducing the number of overall content rules, which as we'll get to is a really valuable outcome, because the more content rules you have, the more complexity you have, and potentially the more confusion that you have. One final thing to note is that the content rules can be set up to match content types as well as their children. So invoices, for example, could also match IT invoices and also match hardware invoices. For the sake of this conversation today, I'm going to say we have two further content rules that are not matching children content types. So we have a content type of invoice, content rule matching content type of IT invoice, and a final content rule matching a content type of hardware invoice, HW invoice. Okay. The last piece of this puzzle to draw it all together is think about a collection of documents, and these are documents identified via their content types. The content rules that we're going to apply to these documents determine which matches are going to get made. So first of all, we had that first content rule all about invoices. So this is the collection of invoices. Now, in the case, we have PDF, we have Word documents. You can imagine any type of document here, of course. The second content rule that we had was talking about IT invoices, so we've got a further subset. And then the last one was covering hardware invoices. And so there's another subset, and there's an overlap in here, as you can see, with this particular document here. So this raises an interesting point that with this overlap, and that's a document or a content type can match multiple rules. And so there's a need for a priority here to say which particular content rule gets precedence over the others. And so as you're setting up content rules, you will be able to set the precedence as you go to identify, in the case of a conflict like this, which content rule sort of wins, if you like. Okay, so now we're going to bring this all together. We have our record category, and then we have a collection of documents. So the content rule in this case is the piece that matches the record category, the retention, right back to the documents, to the records, via this notion of a content type. So as we go through each content rule, the content rules identify the documents or the content, and then assign them to that record category and ultimately to that retention schedule. You can see how it's going to work here. It's looking a bit messy now. So Just to describe a little bit further, in Collabware, this is all associated through the notion of a compliance policy. And a compliance policy connects these four items: the record category, the content rule, which links back to the content types, of course, workflow. This was previously called retention stage in the previous versions of Collabware, and then the notion of authorities. Authorities actually aren't a functional piece of capability within Collabware. It's really just a footnote almost to show which authorities a particular compliance policy links to. Okay, so now we are going to jump into a few other areas of file plans and content types and provide a few guidelines as to how we best leverage these various pieces of the puzzle in the records management solutions we deploy for our clients. The first thing to think about is file plans. So in a physical world, the record categories, of course, are used to find records. Typically, the size of that record category is limited by size of the box, maybe size of the shelf, size of the room, and so on and so forth. So it's limited by the number of records that are in that unit that allow you to still find that record. You can't search through 10,000 different pieces of paper in a physical world to get to a particular piece of paper that you're looking for. Of course, this doesn't exist in an electronic world. The last piece to observe from a file plan in the physical world is that it often describes the file type itself, maybe meeting minutes or agenda, and that doesn't necessarily, unless it's needed for the classification itself, that doesn't necessarily make sense from an electronic perspective, because as we've described, you could use some sort of metadata for the file type. By contrast, a file plan in a digital world is much more around retention schedule. And I think we talked about this 2 weeks ago. The search is electronic, of course. You don't need to worry about the number of records per se. There are some things to be mindful of. We'll get to those. There are no item limits, or there's item limits in the thousands, and these might be constraints of the SharePoint environment. But from a perspective of the file plan itself, there are no file item limits. And then the last piece is you can use that metadata to enhance the search. So you don't need to have a file plan that goes right down to the lowest level of granularity in your file plan. You can actually just use metadata to enhance that search. So a few guidelines for file plans, and this is if you're in the position of being able to redevelop your file plan as you're transitioning from more of a physical file plan into an electronic file plan. These are some ideas. The first one, just keep it simple. It's electronic, so for all of the reasons we've just discussed, simplicity is going to be best. We find that if we can keep file plans to fewer or up to 3 levels, then we find that we have better outcomes generally in our work. And then from a categories perspective, like I say, don't distinguish between file types, but think about categories in a slightly different way. Think about categories in terms of who are the disposition approvers, what are the retention rules, what are the security, what are the different types of reporting you want on those categories. And then again, the record volume doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that much. You don't want to go to the extreme and have 100,000 records in one particular category, perhaps, because you're potentially putting a huge workload on that a disposition approver or disposition approvers. So be a little bit mindful of the business process of managing those records and those categories as you think about it. Okay, so we have a few guidelines for content rules. And these are content rules specific to Collabware. So what we aim to do is we aim to have fewer than 200 content rules in our solutions. We endeavor, I guess, to connect content rules to content types based on the terminal nodes within your record category. And then as you're setting up these content rules, you can make those content rules apply to the children of those content types as well. That's a nice way of simplifying things. So we also have a few guidelines for content types. We aim to have fewer than 500 content types. Content types can get more granular than your record categories, than your content rules. So it does make sense to allow for a greater number of content types. Of course, content types is this sort of child-parent metaphor. So you are going to have hierarchies. It's completely valuable to use hierarchies. We try to stick to 4 or 5 levels of hierarchy at max if we possibly can. And then the last piece from content types is, don't forget that you can also use metadata in conjunction with content types. So let me just explain a little bit how that's going to work. So you may find the need for further levels of distinction between content, either for the purposes of disposition or for the purposes of managing or working with the information itself. So maybe filtering or sorting or searching. So in the former case, in the case that you're going to use it for disposition, you'll need to have an additional content type to create that level of distinction. But in the latter case, where it's more about working with the information or providing a further level of granularity for the end user, you can use metadata. So as an example, employee information might be a single content type, but perhaps you want to be able to identify which employees are in a given jurisdiction, so you can use a lower level content type to maybe treat those records slightly differently. Then going one level further down, you may find a need to identify employees maybe by their office location within a given jurisdiction. So from a records management perspective, their office location may not be relevant. But from organizing people in one office versus the other office, or managing that collection of all the employee information, that might be really relevant. So in this particular case, what I would do is use metadata to determine or to capture the office location. So you'd have 1 or 2 levels of content type here, then you'd use metadata for that final level of distinction, i.e. the office. Our final topic today is the implementation itself. So this is after you've captured all of the record categories and you've designed that user experience. How do you actually go about building or deploying this into SharePoint? It turns out this can be a very simple field, or it can be a very sophisticated endeavor, really depending on your organization's needs. So there's a collection of different tools for configuring SharePoint. The simplest approach would be to use the SharePoint web user interface. So this would be simply you just install SharePoint and then you sort of, with the mouse, you're just clicking around it, building out your team sites, building out your document libraries, configuring your content types, and so on and so on. It's quite straightforward. There's lots of ability to go in and adjust it and edit it and tweak it and refine it. You can sort of see the whole thing building out in front of you, of course. The downside with this approach is it's not very enterprise, it's not very scalable. If anything goes wrong, or if you get to the end of configuring 10 different document libraries and you've configured it wrong, then you have to go and touch each of those 10 again, and you have to go redo all of that work. But it's a relatively simple, relatively straightforward way of doing this. The next approach would be much more of an enterprise class approach. So you could use a tool, for example, Visual Studio would be a tool that we use extensively here at Habanero. Very much more of an enterprise deployment approach. This has source control, tools like automated scripting and deployment, so that once you've specified that setup, once you've specified your subsites, your site collections, your document libraries, your content types, and so on and so forth, you can just execute that script and it deploys it straight into the environment. If you make any mistakes or you want to change it, you can blow away that environment and then you can just rerun that script. So much more sophisticated an environment, much more of a sophisticated deployment approach. But there's also much more to it. You need a developer, potentially a solution architect, infrastructure resources, and so on and so forth to help you make that deployment come to life. And then finally, and this is a tool that we're using increasingly these days, is more of an automated tool that is sort of somewhere between the web user interface and the Visual Studio. The beautiful thing about the web UI approach is that it's a tool that the business analyst can use, or the ECM consultant, whoever it is, they can use this approach. But it's still quite slow and quite cumbersome. So we've developed this tool. It's an automated tool whereby the SharePoint configuration gets set up within Excel, and then it can get run and executed by the business analyst. It's also worth saying just before we go on that you don't have to pick one approach or the other. It's very common that you could have sort of pieces of each of these approaches. You might do, and we would do this, we would deliver most of it, maybe 95% through Visual Studio or 60% through Visual Studio, 30% through the automated tool, and then a few last refinements through the web user interface. So you can sort of pick a mix as well here. The way that Excel Automated Tool works, we call it the site specification build out. It's kind of a geeky name. So you can see along the tabs here in Excel, you can specify your content types, your subsites, your lists, your site collections, and so on and so forth. This is designed explicitly for a business analyst to be able to go in and do this. They can set up some of the different parameters for each area, the field name, whether it's required, whether it's hidden, and so on and so forth. And then the beautiful thing is that the business analysts can deploy this straight into the SharePoint environment themselves. They can just execute this script, and this ugly, very computer-looking thing is a command line prompt, so they can execute that, and it runs straight through the front end. The interesting thing here is that you don't have to have access to the server, so if you're sort of a bit more segregated as an organization, you have your IT team, you have a records management team. The records management team can execute this site specification build-out tool from a remote perspective. They just run it from their laptop, and it runs effectively running through the user interface of SharePoint. And then finally, from a Collabware perspective, there's a couple of ways of configuring Collabware. Firstly, again, as with configuring SharePoint, you could use Visual Studio. You can use a tool within Visual Studio called PowerShell, typically a developer or a solution architect-led activity. And then you can also configure it, which is probably more of the mainstream activity, through the web user interface, and this would just be sort of that good old tool of your mouse and clicking. More of a business analyst or an ECM consultant resource would do that work. Okay, so just before we head into questions, I'll hand this over for questions in just one moment. I just want to cover off what we have discussed today. I hope you found it valuable. So Ben talked about creating a great user experience. It's really interesting because on the surface of it, it could appear that, frankly, all of that is too much. We're talking too much about branding and design questionnaires and usability testing. But we know from our experience that this will result in a really great user experience that your users, or as Ben would call them, your audience, will be really engaged in. Don't forget that we're competing in the global digital workplace. So after Ben's session about creating great user experience, we talked a little bit about how SharePoint and Collabware integrate, and then finally we covered off some of our implementation topics. So I do hope that you found all of that content really valuable. Okay, and that concludes our webinar today. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm Rick Martin, and you can find me at Habanero Consulting. Thank you.